Let's get you some help. You're not alone anymore.
She had a $2 million trust fund sitting in a bank with her name on it. So why was Richard Maxwell's granddaughter standing in line at a homeless shelter at 6 in the morning, wearing the same torn jacket she'd worn for 3 days straight? When he asked her where the money went, her answer would reveal a truth about pride and shame that would haunt him forever. This is the story of Claire Thompson, a 29-year-old woman who went from having millions in the bank to sleeping on a cot in a room with 50 strangers. Her grandfather Richard had built a billion-dollar empire from nothing, had set aside $2 million specifically to make sure she would never struggle the way he had struggled. But on a Tuesday morning in September, Richard found Claire and her husband Derek standing in line outside a homeless shelter, and when he demanded to know what happened to the money, the truth that came out would expose something darker than theft, more devastating than fraud, and more painful than any financial loss. This isn't a story about money disappearing. It's about what happens when pride becomes more powerful than survival, when shame builds a prison stronger than any locked door, and when the very people who could save you become the ones you can't face. Before we go deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Here's what you need to understand. $2 million doesn't just vanish. Bank accounts don't empty themselves. Trust funds have protections, trustees, oversight, rules specifically designed to prevent exactly what happened to Claire. So when Richard discovered his granddaughter living in a shelter, his first assumption was theft. Someone had stolen from her. Someone had taken advantage. Someone would pay for this. But the truth was so much worse than theft. The truth involved a business partner who vanished with everything, legal bills that multiplied like cancer, and a series of choices made in desperation that compounded into disaster. But those weren't the real reasons Claire ended up on the street. The real reason was that she had Richard's phone number in her pocket for 3 months while living in that shelter and never once dialed it. Comment watching if you want to know why she couldn't make that call, because the answer will challenge everything you think you know about family. And here's the question that will haunt you. If you were starving, homeless, and desperate, but calling for help meant admitting you'd failed, what would you choose? Pride or survival? Richard Maxwell didn't plan to drive through that neighborhood on that Tuesday morning. He was in Indianapolis for a business meeting, evaluating a potential real estate investment in a transitioning area south of downtown. He'd built his fortune on being thorough, on seeing properties with his own eyes before committing capital, on understanding neighborhoods at ground level. So he drove slowly through streets that showed signs of both decay and renewal, past closed factories and new coffee shops, taking mental notes about traffic patterns and building conditions. That's when he saw the line outside the homeless shelter. About 40 people waiting for the doors to open at 6 a.m., some sitting on the curb, some standing with their hands in their pockets against the morning chill, all of them wearing that particular expression of weary resignation that comes from having nowhere else to be. Richard had donated to that shelter before, understood the work they did, respected the necessity of it. His eyes scanned the line automatically, the way you notice people when you've spent your whole life observing human behavior, reading situations, understanding dynamics. And that's when his heart stopped. Claire. His granddaughter Claire, standing about halfway down the line, wearing a faded blue jacket he vaguely recognized from years ago. Her hair was pulled back in a ponytail, and she was staring at the ground the way people do when they're trying to be invisible. Next to her stood Derek, her husband, one hand on her back, both of them silent and still. Richard's first thought was that he was hallucinating, that his mind was playing tricks, because there was no universe in which this made sense. His second thought was that they must be volunteering, doing some kind of service project, helping serve breakfast or organize donations. But as he pulled his car over and watched for another minute, he saw details that shattered that hope. The worn-out shoes held together with duct tape. The way Claire clutched a small backpack like it contained everything she owned. The way Derek's jeans were too big, held up with a piece of rope instead of a belt. The thinness of their faces. The exhaustion in their posture. Richard got out of the car, his legs shaking, his mind racing through impossible explanations. As he walked toward them, his phone buzzed in his pocket. A text from his assistant about the morning meeting schedule. The ordinary business of his ordinary day, completely disconnected from the reality unfolding in front of him. "Claire?" Richard said as he approached, his voice coming out rougher than he intended. Claire's head snapped up, and the expression that crossed her face was pure terror. Not surprise. Not embarrassment. Terror. Like a deer caught in headlights, her whole body freezing, her eyes going wide. Derek turned too, and his face went pale. For a moment, nobody moved. The other people in line had started to notice, were watching this well-dressed older man in an expensive coat approaching the young couple in threadbare clothes. "Grandpa," Claire whispered, and her voice cracked on the word. "What are you doing here?" The question was absurd. Richard almost laughed. "What am I doing here? Claire, what are you doing here?" He looked at Derek, then back at Claire, then at the shelter behind them, then at the line of homeless people they were standing with. Are you? I don't understand what I'm seeing." Claire's eyes filled with tears. The people around them were definitely watching now, some curious, some protective of their own, some just waiting to see if there was going to be trouble. "Can we talk somewhere else?" Claire asked, her voice barely audible. "Please." "Not here." Richard nodded, unable to form words. He gestured toward his car, and Claire and Derek followed him like children who'd been caught doing something wrong. They got into the back seat together while Richard sat in the front, turning to face them. The car smelled like leather and expensive cologne. Claire and Derek smelled like the shelter, like industrial soap and too many people in too small a space, and the particular odor of poverty that can't quite be washed away. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Richard stared at his granddaughter, trying to reconcile the person in front of him with the Claire he thought he knew. "How long?" Richard finally asked. "How long have you been living in a shelter?" Derek cleared his throat. 3 months, he said. "We've been in the system for 3 months. 3 months. 90 days. Richard felt something hot and sharp move through his chest. "And you didn't call me? You didn't think to pick up the phone?" Claire was crying now, silently, tears running down her face. "I couldn't," she whispered. Richard's voice got harder. "You couldn't? You couldn't dial a phone? Claire, I don't understand. You have resources. You have a trust fund with $2 million in it. How are you living on the street?" The silence that followed was absolute. Claire looked at Derek. Derek looked at his hands. Neither of them looked at Richard. "Claire," Richard said, his voice dropping to something quiet and dangerous. "Where is your trust fund?" Claire's whole body was shaking now. "It's gone," she said, so quietly he almost didn't hear her. "What do you mean gone?" "Gone," Derek said, his voice flat. "It's all gone. Every penny." Richard felt the world tilt. "That's not possible. You can't just lose $2 million. Where did it go?" And that's when the story came out, in pieces and fragments, both of them talking over each other, filling in details the other left out, painting a picture of a disaster that had unfolded over years. Derek had lost his job 3 years ago. The company downsized, and he went from rising star to unemployed overnight. He'd looked for work for months, sending out hundreds of applications, going to dozens of interviews, but nothing came through. They burned through their savings. They maxed out credit cards buying groceries. They missed rent payments. Then Derek's friend approached him about a business opportunity. A logistics consulting firm. Derek had the experience, the expertise. His friend had the connections, the clients. They just needed capital to get started. $50,000 for licensing, equipment, initial operating expenses. Claire and Derek talked about it for weeks. They knew they could access the trust fund for business purposes. That was one of the approved uses. But they also remembered what Richard had said at their wedding, about not depending on family money, about building something on their own. "We should have called you," Claire said, wiping her eyes. "We should have asked for advice." But Derek felt like he'd already failed by losing his job, and I didn't want to disappoint you, and we convinced ourselves this was a good investment. We told ourselves we'd make the money back, that it was using the trust fund the way it was intended. They accessed the trust fund. $50,000. The business started strong. For 6 months, everything looked good. Clients were coming in, revenue was building. Derek was working 80-hour weeks, but he was happy, energized, building something real. Then one day, Derek's business partner just vanished. Gone. And with him went most of the business's operating capital. The partner had been embezzling, running a side scheme, and when it all came crashing down, he disappeared, leaving Derek to face the consequences. There were lawsuits. Angry clients who had lost money and wanted someone to blame. The investigators cleared Derek of criminal wrongdoing. He'd been deceived too, but financially he was destroyed. The business collapsed. The clients sued. And suddenly Derek and Claire were drowning in legal bills and debts. But here's where the story takes a turn that Richard didn't expect. "We could have survived that," Derek said, his voice tight. "The business failing, the lawsuits, all of it. It would have been hard, but we could have worked through it if that's all it was." "What else was there?" Richard asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know. Claire looked at Derek, and something passed between them, some shared pain that didn't need words. "I got sick," Derek said quietly. "About 6 months after the business collapsed. Started having chest pains, trouble breathing. We didn't have insurance. I ignored it for weeks because we couldn't afford a doctor. When I finally went to the ER, they admitted me immediately. I had a stress-induced heart condition, needed medication, needed monitoring, needed treatment that cost thousands of dollars." Richard closed his eyes. "We used the trust fund to pay the medical bills," Claire said. "We didn't have a choice. Derek needed treatment, or he could have died. What were we supposed to do?" "You were supposed to call me," Richard said, his voice breaking. "You were supposed to tell me what was happening." "And say what?" Claire's voice rose for the first time, anger breaking through the shame. "Hi, Grandpa. We took $50,000 from my trust fund for a business that failed because Derek's partner was a criminal, and now we have legal bills and medical bills and we're drowning. Can you help? How do you make that call? How do you admit that you've failed that badly?" "By picking up the phone," Richard said. "By trusting that I love you more than I care about money." "But it wasn't just that," Derek said. "It wasn't just one thing. It was everything compounding. We paid the medical bills, but then our landlord evicted us because we missed too many rent payments. We moved to a cheaper apartment, but I couldn't find work because word had gotten around about the business collapse, and nobody wanted to hire someone with that kind of reputation. Claire was getting freelance work, but it wasn't enough. We kept thinking the next opportunity would save us, that we just needed one break, one good thing to happen. So you kept using the trust fund," Richard said. "It wasn't a question. A little at a time," Claire admitted. "Never huge amounts. Just enough to get through another month. To pay the rent. To buy food. To keep the lights on. We kept telling ourselves it was temporary, that we'd pay it back, that we just needed time. But time didn't help. Things just kept getting worse." "And you didn't think to call me at any point during this?" Richard asked. "When the business failed? When Derek got sick? When you got evicted? At what point was I going to get a phone call?" The question hung in the air. Claire was sobbing now, her whole body shaking. Derek had his arm around her, but his own face was wet with tears. "I was ashamed," Claire finally said. "Every time I thought about calling, I imagined how disappointed you'd be. You built everything from nothing. You worked so hard your entire life. And I couldn't even keep my life together with a $2 million safety net. What kind of person does that make me? What kind of granddaughter wastes the gift you gave her?" Richard felt his anger draining away, replaced by something heavier. "So you chose homelessness over calling me? You chose to live in a shelter, to sleep on cots, to stand in food lines rather than admit you needed help?" "It wasn't a choice," Derek said quietly. "Not the way you're making it sound. It was more like, every day we told ourselves tomorrow would be better. Tomorrow we'd get a break. Tomorrow things would turn around. And then tomorrow came and it was worse, and we'd tell ourselves one more day. One more week. We kept thinking we could fix it ourselves, that we didn't need to burden you, that we could get back on our feet. And by the time we realized we couldn't, by the time we admitted to ourselves that we were in real trouble, we were too far gone. How do you make that call when you're living in a shelter? How do you say, "Hi, Grandpa, remember that $2 million you gave me? It's gone, and now I'm homeless. Can you help?" The shame of it, it was like a weight we couldn't move. Richard sat there in the front seat of his expensive car, looking at his granddaughter and her husband in their worn-out clothes, and he felt a complex tangle of emotions he couldn't begin to sort through. Anger that they hadn't called. Grief at what they'd been through. Frustration that the safety net he'd built had somehow enabled this disaster instead of preventing it. But underneath everything was love, fierce and protective, and a recognition that what had happened here wasn't really about money at all. If you've ever been too ashamed to ask for help, even when you were desperate, type shame in the comments. Because what happens next will show you the devastating cost of pride. Richard took Claire and Derek to a diner, bought them breakfast, and watched them eat like they were starving, which they probably were. While they ate, he asked more questions, trying to understand the full scope of the disaster. But there was something that wasn't adding up. The trust fund had $2 million, Richard said slowly. You've told me about the business investment, the medical bills, the legal fees, the rent and basic expenses. I'm doing rough math in my head, and even with all of that, you should have had money left. Where did the rest go? Claire and Derek exchanged a look, and Richard saw something new in their faces. Not just shame, but fear. There's something else, Claire said quietly. Something we haven't told you yet. Richard felt his stomach drop. What else could there possibly be? Derek put down his fork, his hands shaking. About 18 months ago, after the business collapsed and the lawsuits started, I got an offer. A job offer from a company based in Seattle. Good salary, benefits, a chance to rebuild my reputation. It was exactly what we needed. Okay, Richard said carefully. So what happened? I couldn't take it, Derek said. Because I was being sued. The lawyers advised me that if I left the state while the litigation was ongoing, it could look like I was trying to avoid responsibility. So I turned it down. I stayed here, working whatever jobs I could get, day labor, warehouse work, anything that paid cash because nobody would hire me officially with the lawsuits hanging over my head. We used the trust fund to settle the lawsuits, Claire said. Not because we were legally required to, the lawyers said we could probably win if we fought it, but because fighting would take years and cost even more in legal fees. So we settled. We paid people back for money Derek's partner had stolen, even though Derek wasn't the one who stole it. Richard stared at them. How much? $400,000, Derek said, his voice barely a whisper. To settle all the claims, to make it go away, to clear my name so I could work again. We thought it was worth it. We thought it would give us a fresh start. But it didn't, Richard said. No, Claire said. Because by the time the settlements were paid and the lawsuits were resolved, we'd been barely surviving for 2 years. Derek's health problems had gotten worse from the stress. We'd gone through even more money on medical care. We'd moved 3 times, each place cheaper than the last. And we'd burned through what was left of the trust fund just trying to survive. Richard did the math in his head. $50,000 for the business. $400,000 for the lawsuit settlements. Medical bills that probably ran to 6 figures over time. Legal fees. Living expenses for 3 years while barely employed. It was possible. It was horrifying, but it was possible. When did the money actually run out? Richard asked. 4 months ago, Claire said. We took the last withdrawal to pay for a motel room for 2 weeks and buy some food. After that, we had nothing. And you lived in your car for 3 weeks, Richard said, remembering what they told him earlier. Until someone broke in and stole what little you had left. After that, we came to the shelter, Derek said. And we've been there ever since. Richard sat back in the booth, trying to process everything. But there was still one question, the one that had been eating at him since he found them in that line. Why didn't you call me? Richard asked again. Even after the money was completely gone, even when you were living in your car, even when you had absolutely nothing left, why didn't you pick up the phone? Claire looked at her grandfather, and her eyes were hollow with exhaustion that went deeper than physical tiredness. Because I had failed, she said simply. You gave me $2 million, Grandpa. $2 million. It was supposed to last me my whole life. It was supposed to protect me from ever being in a situation like this. And I went through all of it in less than 3 years. I squandered it. I made bad decisions. I trusted the wrong person. I let pride keep me from asking for advice. And by the time I realized how badly I'd failed, I was standing in line at a homeless shelter with absolutely nothing to show for any of it. She paused, tears streaming down her face. How do you make that call? How do you tell the person who loves you most in the world that you've wasted everything they gave you? That you've proven yourself to be exactly the kind of person who didn't deserve it in the first place? But I tried, Claire said, her voice breaking. 3 weeks ago. I was at the library, using their computer, and I looked up your office number. I dialed it. The phone rang twice, and then I hung up. Because I realized that even if you helped us, even if you gave us money again, I would know for the rest of my life that I had failed. That I couldn't take care of myself. That without you, I was nothing. Richard felt something crack open in his chest. He reached across the table and took Claire's hand. Listen to me, he said, his voice rough with emotion. You are not nothing. You are my granddaughter. You are smart and kind and strong. And you didn't fail. You survived. You survived a business partner who committed fraud. You survived a health crisis. You survived legal battles and financial devastation and 3 months of homelessness. You're still here. You're still fighting. That's not failure. That's strength. But the money, Claire started. The money is gone, Richard said. Yes. And that's painful. But money is replaceable. You're not. And I need you to understand something, sweetheart. I didn't set up that trust fund because I thought you were weak or incapable. I set it up because life is unpredictable. Because bad things happen to good people. Because sometimes you trust the wrong person or get sick at the wrong time or face circumstances you can't control. The trust fund was supposed to be a safety net, not a test. He paused, making sure she was looking at him. You didn't fail me. I failed you. I gave you money, but I didn't give you permission to fail. I taught you to be independent and self-sufficient, but I didn't teach you that asking for help is also a form of strength. I made you feel like you had to handle everything on your own, and that was wrong. Derek spoke up, his voice hoarse. Sir, this wasn't your fault. I'm the one who trusted my business partner without doing proper due diligence. I'm the one who couldn't provide for Claire. You're the one who's been carrying guilt that doesn't belong to you. Richard interrupted. Derek, your business partner was a criminal. That's not your fault. Getting sick from stress isn't your fault. The economy, the job market, the legal system that required you to pay for someone else's crimes, none of that is your fault. He looked at both of them. But staying silent when you needed help, that is something you both chose. And I need to understand why. Because it's not just about this situation. It's about whether you'll ever feel safe enough to ask for help when you need it in the future. There was a long silence. Finally, Derek spoke, and when he did, his voice carried a weight of something that had been buried for a long time. My father was an alcoholic, Derek said quietly. He drank away everything my mother earned. She worked 2 jobs to keep us fed while he sat on the couch and drank. When I was 16, he came to me asking for money. He said he needed it for rent, for food, for bills. I believed him. I gave him everything I'd saved from my part-time job. $300. He spent it all on alcohol in 2 days. Derek's hands were shaking. My mother sat me down after and told me something I've never forgotten. She said, Derek, never let someone else's weakness become your burden. Never give money to someone who'll waste it. Never enable failure. And I internalized that. I promised myself I would never be the person asking for help, never be a burden, never be like my father. So when the business failed, Derek continued, when I needed to access Claire's trust fund, it felt like becoming my father. Like proving I was weak. And every time we had to take more money, it felt like confirmation that I was exactly the kind of person my mother warned me never to become. Someone who couldn't take care of himself. Someone who wasted other people's resources. Richard listened to this and felt a deep sadness. Derek, you're not your father. Asking for help when you need it is not the same as taking advantage. Using resources responsibly during a crisis is not enabling failure. But how do you know the difference? Derek asked, and there was genuine anguish in his voice. How do you know when you're in a legitimate crisis versus when you're just failing? How do you know when to push through versus when to ask for help? And there it was, Richard thought. The real question. The one that had kept them silent and suffering. They didn't know where the line was between perseverance and self-destruction. So they'd chosen to err on the side of not asking, and it had cost them everything. But what Richard was about to discover would reveal that the cost was even higher than he thought. After breakfast, Richard drove Claire and Derek to the library where they spent their days. It was a beautiful old building downtown with high ceilings and tall windows, and it was filled with people like them, people with nowhere else to be, using the library as a refuge from the street. Claire and Derek had a routine, Richard learned. They arrived when it opened at 9, found a quiet corner, and spent the day searching for jobs, filling out applications, taking online courses to learn new skills. They'd been doing this for 3 months straight. How many applications have you sent? Richard asked Derek. Since we became homeless? 472, Derek said without hesitation. I keep a spreadsheet. 472 applications. 11 interviews. 0 offers. Why no offers after the interviews? Richard asked. Different reasons, Derek said. Sometimes they find out about the lawsuit history and they get concerned even though I was cleared. Sometimes they want references from my last employer, but the company went under so there's nobody to call. Sometimes I think they can just tell, you know. They look at me and they see someone who's desperate, someone who's been out of work too long, someone who's staying in a homeless shelter. People can smell failure. Richard watched his granddaughter and her husband set up their workspace at the library table, pulling out notebooks and a single shared laptop that looked like it was held together with hope and determination. Where did you get the laptop? Richard asked. The shelter has a program, Claire explained. They provide basic technology to people who are looking for work. It's old, slow, crashes sometimes, but it's enough. For the next few hours, Richard sat with them and watched them work. He watched Derek methodically go through job listings, tailor his resume for each position, write cover letters that tried to explain gaps in employment without revealing too much. He watched Claire work on her freelance portfolio, reaching out to potential clients, bidding on small projects that paid barely anything but kept her skills current. What struck Richard most was the quiet dignity in how they went about it. No complaining. No self-pity. Just steady, determined effort, hour after hour, day after day, even though they'd been doing this for months with almost nothing to show for it. During lunch, which Claire and Derek skipped because they were rationing what little food they had, Richard asked more questions about their daily life. What's the hardest part? He asked. Claire and Derek looked at each other. You want the truth? Claire asked. Richard nodded. The hardest part is staying clean, Claire said. I know that sounds shallow, but it's true. The shelter has showers, but there's always a line, and you only get 10 minutes. Try washing your hair in 10 minutes when you're sharing a bathroom with 50 people. Try staying presentable enough for job interviews when you have 2 outfits and you're washing them in sinks. The hardest part for me is watching her go through this, Derek said quietly. Watching the woman I love live like this because of my failures. Watching her make the best of it, stay positive, keep trying, when she should be living in a nice apartment with her own space and her own bathroom and food in the refrigerator. Stop, Claire said firmly. We've talked about this. It's not your fault. We're in this together. But if I had just... Derek started. If you had just what? Claire interrupted. Not trusted your business partner? You had no way of knowing he was embezzling. Not gotten sick? You can't control stress-induced health problems. Not settled the lawsuits? We made that decision together. Derek, you have to stop carrying all of this yourself. Richard watched this exchange and saw something he hadn't seen before. The way they supported each other. The way they had developed a language of survival, of mutual encouragement, of refusing to let the circumstances break their relationship. They had lost everything, but they hadn't lost each other. Around 3 in the afternoon, something happened that Richard would never forget. A security guard approached their table. Excuse me, the guard said, looking at Claire and Derek. I need to see your library cards. Richard saw Claire and Derek tense immediately. We have them, Claire said, pulling out 2 worn cards from her bag. The guard examined them. These expired last month. You need to renew them if you want to continue using the facilities. We'll renew them, Derek said. What's the fee? $20 per card, the guard said. Richard watched the color drain from Derek's face. $40. A tiny amount for Richard, an impossible amount for 2 people with literally nothing. We'll take care of it by the end of the week, Derek said, his voice steady even though Richard could see his hands shaking. Today, the guard said. The policy is if your card is expired, you need to renew it same day or leave the premises. Sir, we need these computers to look for work, Claire said, and Richard heard desperation creeping into her voice. We can get the money, we just need a few days. I'm sorry, but policy is policy, the guard said. You'll need to leave and come back when you can pay the renewal fee. Richard had been silent through this exchange, watching, learning. But now he stood up. I'll pay for the renewals, Richard said, pulling out his wallet. The guard looked at him, then at Claire and Derek, clearly trying to figure out the relationship. That's not necessary, Grandpa, Claire said quickly, her face red. We can figure it out. It's $40, Richard said. I'm paying it. He handed the guard his credit card before Claire could protest further. After the guard left with the cards to process the renewal, Claire put her face in her hands. You shouldn't have done that, she said, her voice muffled. You shouldn't have to pay for our library cards. We're adults. We should be able to afford a $40 renewal fee. Claire, look at me, Richard said. She looked up, and her eyes were wet. You've been living in a shelter for 3 months, Richard said gently. You've been standing in food lines and washing your clothes in sinks and sleeping on a cot in a room full of strangers. And you're upset about me paying for a library card? It's the principle, Claire said. You've already given us so much. The trust fund, the education, everything. And we wasted it. We don't deserve more. Stop saying that, Richard said, his voice harder now. Stop saying you don't deserve help. Stop measuring your worth by whether you've made mistakes. Stop punishing yourself by refusing assistance that would make your life easier. But how do we know when we deserve help and when we're just being weak? Derek asked, echoing his earlier question. And that's when Richard realized something. They weren't just ashamed of having failed. They were terrified that accepting help again would prove they were fundamentally incapable, that they couldn't survive without constant rescue, that they were exactly the kind of people who didn't deserve the advantages they'd been given. The shame wasn't just about the past. It was about what accepting help in the present would mean about who they were. If you've ever felt like you didn't deserve help, even when you desperately needed it, comment unworthy because what Richard does next will change everything. That evening, Richard told Claire and Derek he needed to think about some things and he'd be in touch the next day. He drove back to his hotel, but he didn't sleep. He spent the night thinking about everything he'd learned, everything he'd seen, everything that had happened. And he realized that just giving them money again would be the worst thing he could do. Not because they didn't need it, but because it wouldn't address the real problem. The real problem was that they had internalized their failure so deeply that they no longer believed in their own ability to build anything. The real problem was that shame had become a prison stronger than any locked door. The real problem was that they needed more than financial support. They needed to believe in themselves again. But there was something else Richard had noticed, something that troubled him deeply. In all their explanations, in all their stories about where the money went, there was a gap. A period of about 6 months where the timeline didn't quite add up. And Richard needed to know what happened during those 6 months before he could decide how to help. The next morning, Richard asked to meet Claire and Derek at a coffee shop. When they arrived, he had documents spread out on the table, printed financial statements from the trust fund showing every withdrawal, every date, every amount. "I need you to walk me through this," Richard said, pointing to a series of withdrawals from 18 months ago. "These withdrawals, they're not matching up with the expenses you told me about. 20,000 here, 15,000 here, another 25,000 2 weeks later. What were these for?" Claire and Derek went very still. "We told you," Derek said. "Medical bills, legal fees, living expenses." "I've been doing the math," Richard said. "And the amounts don't add up. You're missing something. What happened 18 months ago?" The silence stretched out. Finally, Claire spoke, and her voice was so quiet Richard had to lean forward to hear her. "I was pregnant," she said. Richard felt the world stop. "What?" "18 months ago, I got pregnant," Claire said, and tears were already streaming down her face. "We were already in trouble financially, already stressed about everything with the business collapse and the lawsuits. And then I found out I was pregnant, and we didn't know what to do. The pregnancy was complicated," Derek said, his voice hollow. "Claire developed preeclampsia. She needed constant monitoring, medication, possible bed rest. We didn't have insurance. The doctors estimated it would cost at least $50,000 just to get through the pregnancy safely, maybe more. So we used the trust fund," Claire said. "We paid for the prenatal care, the medications, everything we needed to give our baby a chance." "Where is the baby?" Richard asked, though he was afraid he already knew the answer. "I lost her at 24 weeks, Claire whispered. "We'd been doing everything right. Following all the doctor's orders. Taking all the medications. But my blood pressure spiked anyway, and they couldn't get it under control, and our daughter, she didn't make it." The grief in Claire's voice was so raw it was physically painful to hear. "After that, we had to use more of the trust fund to pay for the emergency delivery, the hospital stay, the funeral," Derek said, and his voice broke on the last word. "We buried our daughter, and then we got a bill for $30,000 for the medical care that didn't save her." Richard sat there, stunned. All this time, while he'd been thinking about money and business decisions and financial failures, his granddaughter had been carrying the grief of losing a child on top of everything else. "Why didn't you tell me?" Richard asked. "When it happened, why didn't you call me?" "Because I was drowning," Claire said. "I had just lost my baby. Derek was falling apart. We were being sued. We had no money. I couldn't face telling you that on top of everything else going wrong, I'd lost your great-granddaughter too. It felt like I couldn't do anything right. I couldn't keep my business from failing, couldn't keep my husband healthy, couldn't even keep my baby alive." She was sobbing now, and Derek had his arms around her, and Richard felt tears on his own face. "Her name was Emma," Claire said. "We named her Emma Rose. And she's buried in a cemetery about 20 minutes from here, and I visit her grave every Sunday because that's the one day the shelter lets us stay during the day if we want. And I tell her I'm sorry. I'm sorry that I couldn't give her a better life, that I couldn't protect her, that I failed her the way I've failed everyone." Richard got up and moved to their side of the table. He wrapped his arms around both of them and held them while they cried, while they finally let out some of the grief they'd been carrying alone for so long. and he made a decision about what he was going to do next. But it wasn't what anyone expected. 3 days later, Richard asked Claire and Derek to meet him at a small office building he owned downtown. When they arrived, he led them to a conference room where several other people were waiting. "This is Dr. Patricia Wilson," Richard said, introducing a woman in her 50s. "She's a therapist who specializes in grief and trauma. This is Marcus Chin, a financial counselor. This is Angela Rodriguez, a career consultant. And this is James Mitchell, he runs job placement programs for one of my companies." Claire and Derek looked confused and overwhelmed. "Sit down," Richard said gently. "We have a lot to talk about." Over the next 2 hours, Richard laid out a plan. Not a rescue. A rebuild. "Here's what I understand now," Richard began. "The money is gone, and we can't change that. But the money was never really the problem. The problem is that you've been through a series of devastating losses, financial, professional, medical, personal, and you've been trying to process all of that alone while also just trying to survive. That's not sustainable. Nobody can do that." He looked at both of them. "So we're going to address all of it, not just the money. Dr. Wilson is going to work with you on processing the grief of losing Emma, the trauma of the business collapse, the stress of the homelessness. Because you can't build a stable future while you're carrying unprocessed trauma. Marcus is going to work with you on understanding what happened financially, not to shame you but to help you develop the skills and knowledge to manage money better in the future. You're going to learn about budgeting, about risk assessment, about when to use resources and when to conserve them." Richard continued. "Angela is going to help you rebuild your professional identities. Derek, we're going to address the reputation issues, get you proper references, help you understand how to talk about what happened in a way that's honest but doesn't disqualify you from opportunities. Claire, we're going to restart your design business with proper support this time. And James is going to offer Derek a job," Richard said. "Not a handout, not a favor, but a real job with real responsibilities in the logistics division of one of my companies. You'll start at entry level because that's where you need to start, but if you do the work, you can build from there." Derek looked stunned. "Sir, I don't know what to say." "You can say yes or no," Richard said. "This isn't charity. I expect you to show up, work hard, prove yourself. If you can't do that, you'll be fired just like anyone else. But if you can, you'll have a chance to rebuild your career." "What about housing?" Claire asked quietly. Richard nodded to another man in the room he hadn't introduced yet. "This is David Park. He manages several apartment complexes I own. He's going to provide you with a modest 2-bedroom apartment for 1 year. Not free, you'll pay rent, but it will be subsidized and affordable based on Derek's entry-level salary. 1 year," Richard emphasized. "During that year, you're going to work with all of these people. You're going to do the therapy, the financial counseling, the career development. You're going to show up to work, rebuild your savings, learn new skills. At the end of the year, we'll evaluate. If you've made progress, we can talk about continuing support. If you've fallen back into old patterns, if you've refused help, if you've let pride prevent you from doing the work, then the support ends. But here's the most important part," Richard said, leaning forward. "You have to promise me something. You have to promise that you will never, ever, suffer in silence again. That you will ask for help when you need it. That you will trust me enough to tell me when things are getting bad before they become catastrophic. Because I can't help you if I don't know you're struggling." Claire was crying. "I don't know if we can accept this." "Why not?" Richard asked. "Because we failed once already," Claire said. "Because we wasted $2 million. Because we've proven we can't be trusted with help." "No," Richard said firmly. "You've proven you're human. You've proven you can face catastrophic loss and keep going. You've proven you can survive homelessness without losing your dignity or your marriage. You've proven you can show up every day at that library and apply for jobs even when it feels hopeless. Those are not the qualities of people who can't be trusted. Those are the qualities of people who deserve support." He paused, making sure they were both looking at him. I didn't set up that trust fund because I thought you'd never make mistakes. I set it up to help you recover from mistakes. But I made an error. I gave you money without giving you the other things you needed: education, guidance, permission to fail, and most importantly, the knowledge that I would still love you even if you lost every penny. So this time, I'm doing it differently. Richard continued. This time, it's not just money. It's a comprehensive support system. And this time, you're going to let me help you, not because you're weak, but because that's what family does. We help each other. We show up. We don't let each other suffer alone. Derek was shaking his head, overwhelmed. I don't deserve this. After everything I've done, all the mistakes I made, the trust one betrayed. Derek, stop. Richard interrupted. Let me ask you something. Do you love my granddaughter? More than anything, Derek said immediately. And have you been faithful to her through all of this? Even when everything was falling apart, even when you were living in a shelter, did you stand by her? Of course, Derek said. She's my wife. I made a vow. Then you've already proven yourself where it matters most, Richard said. You protected your marriage even when you couldn't protect your finances. You stayed together even when it would have been easier to fall apart. That tells me who you are. The business failure, the lawsuit, the money, those were circumstances. They don't define your character. He looked at Claire. And you. You lost a child. You lost your financial security. You lost your home. And you're still here. You're still fighting. You're still showing up every day trying to build something. That's not failure. That's courage. But we should have called you, Claire whispered. Yes, Richard agreed. You should have. And I wish you had. But I understand why you didn't. And now I'm giving you the opportunity to make a different choice. You can accept this help, do the work, rebuild your life. Or you can say no, walk away, keep trying to do it alone. What's it going to be? Claire and Derek looked at each other. Some silent communication passed between them. Finally, Derek spoke. We'll do the work, he said. Whatever it takes. We'll do it. Good, Richard said. Then let's get started. Over the next few months, Claire and Derek moved into their new apartment. It was small but clean, a 2-bedroom in a safe neighborhood with a kitchen and a bathroom and walls that were their own. The first night they slept there, Claire called Richard crying. I'd forgotten what it felt like, she said. What felt like? Richard asked. To have a door I can lock. To take a shower without a time limit. To cook food in my own kitchen. To feel safe. I'd forgotten what safety felt like. Derek started his job in the logistics division. His supervisor, who knew Derek's background, gave him a fair chance to prove himself. Derek showed up early every day, stayed late, treated every task with the intensity of someone who knew what it was like to have nothing. Within 3 months, he received his first positive performance review. Within 6 months, he was training new employees. Claire restarted her design business with Angela's help, this time with proper business planning, realistic pricing, sustainable practices. She started small, taking projects she could handle, building a portfolio, establishing a reputation. Her income was modest at first, but it was growing, and more importantly, it was earned through her own work. Both of them attended weekly therapy sessions with Dr. Wilson. They talked about Emma, about the grief they'd been carrying, about the trauma of losing everything, about the shame that had kept them silent. They learned that suffering in silence doesn't make you strong, it makes you isolated. They learned that asking for help isn't weakness, it's wisdom. They worked with Marcus, the financial counselor, to understand what had happened with the trust fund, to identify the decisions that had been sound and the ones that had been driven by fear or pride or desperation. They learned how to budget, how to save, how to evaluate risk, how to make financial decisions based on logic rather than emotion. And every week, Richard checked in with them. Not hovering, not managing their lives, but present. Available. Letting them know that he was there if they needed him. 6 months into the program, Claire told Richard she was pregnant again. I'm terrified, she admitted. After what happened with Emma, I'm terrified that something will go wrong again. We'll get you the best care, Richard said. We'll make sure you have everything you need. But Claire, even if you're scared, this is something to celebrate. This is hope. This is the future you're building. The pregnancy was carefully monitored. Claire had a team of specialists, regular checkups, everything that had been missing the first time because of financial constraints. She developed mild preeclampsia again, but this time it was caught early, managed carefully, and didn't become catastrophic. At 37 weeks, Claire gave birth to a healthy baby boy. They named him Noah Richard Thompson. Richard for his great-grandfather. Noah for new beginnings. When Richard held his great-grandson for the first time, he thought about everything that had led to this moment. The money lost and found. The pride that had almost destroyed them. The shame that had kept them silent. The choice to finally ask for help. You know what I've learned through all of this? Richard said to Claire as she recovered in the hospital. Money doesn't protect anyone from life. It can provide resources, create opportunities, offer security. But it can't prevent loss. It can't guarantee success. It can't make hard things easy. What protects people is connection. It's knowing you have support. It's believing you can ask for help. It's understanding that failure is not the end of your story. The trust fund was supposed to protect you, Richard continued. But what you actually needed wasn't $2 million. What you needed was to know that even if you lost $2 million, even if you failed completely, even if everything fell apart, I would still be there. That's what I should have taught you from the beginning. 1 year after Richard found them at the homeless shelter, he met with Claire and Derek for their official program evaluation. They sat in the same conference room where he'd laid out the original plan, and Richard reviewed the reports from their therapist, their financial counselor, their career consultant, Derek's supervisor. Every report was positive. They had done the work. They had shown up. They had made progress. I'm proud of you, Richard said. You've rebuilt your lives. You've shown that the homelessness wasn't who you are, it was just something that happened to you. We couldn't have done it without all the support, Claire said. Without the housing, the jobs, the therapy, the counseling. You're right, Richard agreed. You couldn't have. And that's not a failure, that's a reality. Nobody builds a life completely alone. Everyone needs support. The difference between where you are now and where you were a year ago isn't that you suddenly got stronger or smarter or more capable. It's that you finally let yourself receive the help you needed. He pulled out a document. I've been thinking a lot about that trust fund, about what it was supposed to be and what it became. And I've realized that setting aside money for you was only half of what I should have done. The other half was teaching you how to use it, when to use it, how to evaluate decisions, how to recover from mistakes, how to ask for help. So I'm not setting up another trust fund, Richard continued. Instead, I'm creating what I'm calling a family legacy foundation. It will have funds set aside for emergencies, opportunities, support when needed. But it will also have education built in, mentorship, guidance. And most importantly, it will require regular communication. Monthly family meetings where we talk about finances, goals, challenges. Where you can bring problems while they're still small instead of waiting until they're catastrophic. There's money in the foundation for Noah's future, Richard said. For his education, his opportunities, his security. But there's also a requirement that before he can access any of it, he'll go through financial education. He'll learn about budgeting, investing, risk management, all the things I should have taught you before I gave you access to resources. Claire was crying, but these were different tears. You're still willing to do this? After we wasted $2 million? Claire, listen to me, Richard said, his voice gentle but firm. You didn't waste it. You used it during a crisis. You made some decisions that in hindsight weren't ideal, but you made them from a place of trying to survive, trying to protect your marriage, trying to save your baby. That's not waste. That's life happening in all its messy, complicated, painful reality. The money is gone, and that's okay. Richard continued. I have more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes. What I don't have is another granddaughter. What I don't have is another chance to watch you build your life. What I can't replace is you. So yes, I'm willing to do this. But this time, we're doing it differently. This time, you're going to let me be part of your life, not just a source of emergency funding. Over the next few years, Claire and Derek continued to grow. Derek moved into a management position at a different company, his reputation restored, his confidence rebuilt. Claire's design business became sustainable, then successful, eventually hiring her first employee. They bought a small house, started a college fund for Noah, built a life that was theirs, earned through work and discipline and the hard-won wisdom that comes from having lost everything and finding your way back. But the most important thing they built was trust. Trust that they could tell Richard when things were getting difficult before they became catastrophic. Trust that asking for help didn't mean they were failures. Trust that their worth wasn't measured by their bank account or their success rate, but by their willingness to keep trying, keep growing, keep showing up for each other and for themselves. The monthly family meetings that Richard had instituted became sacred time. They talked about money, yes, but they also talked about Noah's development, Claire's business challenges, Derek's career goals, Richard's health as he got older. They talked about Emma, keeping her memory alive. They talked about the shelter, about the people they'd met there, about the reality that they were only a few bad decisions away from being back in that situation, and that awareness kept them humble and grateful. Richard increased his support for the homeless shelter where he found them, not just with money but with programs. Job training, financial literacy classes, therapy services. He created a pathway similar to what he'd done for Claire and Derek, offering structured support to people who wanted to rebuild but needed help to do it. Claire and Derek volunteered at the shelter regularly, talking to people who were going through what they'd gone through, offering hope without minimizing the difficulty, sharing their story as proof that recovery was possible. On the 5th anniversary of the day Richard found them in that line, Claire wrote him a letter. She thanked him for the trust fund, yes, but more importantly, she thanked him for not giving up on them when they'd given up on themselves. She thanked him for understanding that what they needed wasn't just money but connection, guidance, permission to fail, and the knowledge that they were loved regardless of their circumstances. "You taught me that asking for help isn't weakness," Claire wrote. "You taught me that failure is only permanent if you stop trying. You taught me that pride can cost more than any financial disaster. And most importantly, you taught me that family isn't just about being there when things are good. It's about showing up when everything falls apart." Richard kept that letter on his desk, next to a photo of Claire, Derek, and Noah. Whenever he had a hard day in business, whenever he faced a difficult decision, he looked at that photo and remembered what actually mattered. Not the buildings he'd constructed or the companies he'd built or the money he'd accumulated, but the people he'd helped, the lives he'd impacted, the family he'd chosen to show up for even when it would have been easier to walk away. When Noah turned 5, he asked his mother why they had breakfast with great-grandpa Richard every month. "Because family takes care of each other," Claire told him. "And taking care of each other means talking to each other, sharing our problems, asking for help when we need it, and showing up even when it's hard." "Did you ever need help, Mommy?" Noah asked with the innocence of a child who doesn't yet understand the weight of that question. Claire looked at Derek, and they shared a glance that carried 5 years of history, of pain, of recovery, of growth. "Yes, sweetheart," Claire said. "Mommy and Daddy needed a lot of help once. And Great-Grandpa Richard gave it to us. Not just money, but love and support and the belief that we could be better than our worst moments. That's what family does." "What if you need help again?" Noah asked. "Then we'll ask for it," Derek said. "Because we've learned that there's no shame in needing help. The only shame is suffering in silence when people who love you are ready and willing to be there." Richard listened to this conversation and felt a deep satisfaction. The cycle was broken. Noah would grow up understanding that asking for help was normal, that failure was survivable, that worth wasn't measured in dollars but in character, resilience, and the willingness to keep trying even when things got hard. The $2 million that Claire had lost had actually bought something far more valuable than financial security. It had bought wisdom, humility, connection, and a family legacy that would last long after the money would have run out. And Richard realized that all of this, was worth more than any business deal he'd ever made. So let me ask you this, and I really want you to think about your answer. If you were struggling, desperate, with resources available but too ashamed to ask for them, would you suffer in silence or would you make the call? And here's the harder question: what would it take for you to believe you deserve help? Comment silence if you've ever suffered alone rather than ask for help, or call if you would reach out. Because the answer might tell you something important about yourself. Here's what this story teaches us: pride is expensive. It costs more than any financial loss. Shame builds prisons stronger than any locked door. And sometimes the people who love us most show that love not by rescuing us immediately, but by walking alongside us while we learn to rescue ourselves. Money can be replaced. Time cannot. Relationships cannot. And the years that Claire and Derek spent suffering in silence, those are years they'll never get back. But the wisdom they gained, the strength they developed, the connection they rebuilt with Richard and with each other, that's permanent. That's the real inheritance. Where are you watching from? Have you ever let pride keep you from asking for help when you needed it? What would you say to someone who's suffering in silence right now? Share your thoughts in the comments, because someone needs to hear your story today. Thank you for watching Western Stories, where we share modern folktales about family, legacy, and the lessons that shape who we become. Subscribe for more stories that will challenge what you think you know about success, failure, and what truly matters in life. Hit that bell so you never miss a story. And next week, we have something that will absolutely shock you. A man discovered his late father had a complete second family that no one knew about, and the will reading revealed a secret that would tear two families apart. Make sure you're subscribed because you won't want to miss it. Until then, remember this: your worst moment is not your final moment. The choice you make after you fall determines everything. I'll see you in the next one.